sometimes do things we're not going to play during the show just because they're actually better things at a sound check to give a better example of sometimes just making sure that we have a good balance of audio. So, yeah, fire away.
We're on. We're good. So talk about being here at the Kodak and being here in Hollywood. And can you remember back to your first time playing LA in the Hollywood area?
I was talking to my wife about that on the way here in the car. That it was, we were on our first trip to the West Coast, having started, as most British bands did, over in New York, playing the Fillmore East and places. We heard about this mystical place where the wagon trains had rolled, called the West Coast, and people said, "Oh, you're gonna love it over there. It's great," And everybody just said, "Oh, you'll love the West Coast." It was like this kind of holy mantra, the West Coast. So after a few weeks, when we found ourselves wending our way to the West Coast, it was with very high expectations. And it was with those high expectations that I checked in, as all the British rock bands did, into the Hyatt House on Sunset Strip, whereupon the awful reality of the West Coast suddenly came and hit home hard. Because, you could walk down the street a little bit, and go into some boutique places or get a sandwich or something, but there was a fair chance you would be picked up by a squad car and put up against the wall, because we didn't know you weren't supposed to walk around in LA. And I made the mistake of walking around in LA today, whatever it is, 35 years later. And I only walked about 3/4 of a mile up, along the road to a shopping mall, and 3/4 of a mile back. And I am now polluted from the inside out. I mean, the choking traffic fumes. God. So, yeah, the West Coast is still a kind of a best thought about, but unless you're sitting in your air-conditioned, hermetically sealed motor car, then probably not a good place to walk around.
Right. Well, you mentioned the smoke, and you talk about that hermetically sealed. How important is that for you in terms of your playing and your voice to actually sustain that?
Well, it is, because what I do is an aerobic thing for 2 hours. In terms of breathing, it's just I take 5, 6, 7, 8 breaths for every one that a member of the audience takes. So I'm processing all this stuff all the time, and it's any smoke that's in the venue. I mean, for instance, in Spain, they still smoke, and they smoke inside theaters or in clubs or whatever, and the air is blue. And I can't do it. I mean, it's on our contracts, there must be no smoking in venues where we play. But there are places in Europe and in the Far East where it still happens. And that to me is really damaging. As an ex-smoker, I know the degree to which it really does cause me serious difficulties. And it's probably harder being 58 than being, 28, coping with that degree of pollution in the atmosphere. So I try to stay out of traffic, and I don't. Flying on a day of a show as well is kind of very dehydrating. So it's bad enough if you're a really good singer, but I've never been a natural or happy singer. I've always had to struggle to sing, and it just makes it so much worse. So sometimes, as I said to young Lucia at soundcheck, hey, if you want to run through this, not a problem. I'll stand here and play flute all night. But just don't ask me to sing everything I have to sing,
Are those lessons you learned early on, or are those lessons you learned?
Well, I think you do. I think you learn as you go along, and sometimes you learn by other people's problems. I was Lou Gramm, singer from Foreigner, who a few months ago we did a TV show together. In fact, I had put his name forward to the producers of a big German, huge TV thing, 50 years of rock and roll. I said, "Oh, Lou Gramm, get him over here, and we'll, the classic rock singer, the great rock tenor." I've always had a huge regard for the sound of his voice, his diction, his clarity, and his accuracy, as well as the bravado that came with those slightly sexist kind of Foreigner hits back in the 80s, was it? He turned up, and he'd been going through obviously a lot of difficulties with illness and brain tumor and stuff. But I talked to him about the singing, and he said, it was a nightmare. The guitar player had written all these songs in impossible keys, and Lou could do it in the studio. Take a deep breath and get there and hit those notes, but to try and do it every night on stage, night after night, in a 2-hour show, that was too much for Lou and for most people. It's so you learn sometimes by hearing other people and hearing their stories about the impossibility of keeping those standards. So
you're in the thick of it again now, right? Smack in the middle of a tour, right? Talk about this tour and what you're doing with this one, if you can kind of put into words and what you're hoping to do when you have the news, DVD and CD.
Well, people always say, well, what's new with Jethro Tull? And usually the answer is, well, not a lot. Another year older, and George Bush still hasn't got it about climate change. There's nothing seems to change, really. But, on this tour, we're in some way focusing on the Aqualung album, because I think it was 35 years ago that we started recording it, or writing the songs for the Aqualung album. So to me, it's kind of 35th anniversary, which is an odd, it's not like it's the 30th or the 25th or something, it's the 35th. So, but whatever, it's a long time ago. And we recorded the Aqualung album live at the end of last year, so we decided to give this away with all the concert tickets on these 2 US tours. Elsewhere, it's released commercially, but with all the royalties going to charities for homeless people, as befits the character in the title track. So it's kind of an Aqualung tour in a way, because we play most of the songs from the Aqualung album every night, and we also have our guest, not our opening act, but our guest performer, Lucia Micarelli, who's a 22-year-old violinist who escaped from Juilliard College, where she was being trained to be a nice young lady of the violin classical persuasion. But she escaped and found her way onto a rock and roll tour bus and has never looked sideways since, because she's kind of a rock and roll girl, really, at heart. But a great classical player. She's a very, very good player. And I played with an awful lot of, over the years, lots of small orchestras, chamber orchestras, string quartets, and more recently I do quite a lot of concerts as a solo artist with orchestras in different parts of the world. Not so far in the US, but everywhere else, and lots of other places. So I'm used to playing with a lot of fiddlers, and Lucia is really far and away the best. And she has feel, which is rare for people who've been taught in a traditional academic classical way. She has a kind of a feel, you can relax with her, she's playing by feel, and you kind of look in each other's eyes, and it's like playing with someone who's grown up with rock music, except that she didn't. She's just kind of picked it up in the last 2 or 3 years, and has a fondness for folk music and jazz and classic rock stuff, as well as the classical repertoire.
Talk about like the craft and the artistry of yourself and the people you play with over the years, because we were talking earlier, fans of your band are people that always have appreciated that, maybe above all else, and you've been lumped into a million categories over the years, but you've always been real musicians that have enjoyed your music, and you've always kind of prided yourself in that, I would assume. You guys have always...
I don't really stop to think about priding myself or anything. I just enjoy playing music, and I enjoy, there's so much out there, and with the exception of Caribbean steel drums, Hawaiian guitars, and the broad swathe of American country and Western music, I pretty much enjoy everything else, and particularly what these days is, in record store parlance, is called world music. I just like folk music from different parts of the world. I enjoy hearing the music of people of different cultures, different colors, different religions, different... It's all about, I don't know, part of it's kind of a romantic thing, because a lot of those places I personally go and visit and play in, so I'm always interested to hear the music of those indigenous people. If I go to Russia, I want to hear some Russian music. I don't want to hear some Russian heavy metal band trying to sound like Metallica. I want to hear some band that are playing contemporary music, but based on their own heritage and their culture. And happily in places like Russia and Finland and India and lots of places I go, they really do that. They have not lost sight of their kind of their folklore and their tradition, but there are lots of contemporary young bands playing music which is a really interesting hybrid of of their own history, their culture, and using contemporary instruments as well as traditional instruments, using contemporary arrangements. And so there's an interesting balance that goes on that I don't hear so often in Western Europe, and I don't really hear it in the same way in the USA, but maybe the equivalent in the USA is just called rock and roll. I don't know, because this is where it's from. It's not from Russia, and frankly, I have no interest in hearing people trying to pretend to be American unless they are, in which case it's their music and their culture, and that's okay. But I get very tired of hearing German artists singing in impeccable Midwestern American accents that are kind of their idea of, somewhere across this big American continent there is this kind of American voice, and they all want to have it, and they slavishly copy what they hear and see on MTV, which is the kiss of death for everyone.
Your voice has been, if you were to define what your voice has been over the years.
Well, my voice is a scratchy old instrument that is mine, and I try not to. I think most of my working life, I've successfully avoided falling into the trap of singing or trying to sing with this strange, ubiquitous American accent. And I do find it, much as I have great respect and admiration for Elton John and Mick Jagger and possibly Rod Stewart and a few others, what just gets on my tits is the fact that these people sing in this ridiculous American accent, but they talk in a completely different accent. And essentially, probably out of all the folks that I would think are my peers, the only one who seems to have developed a singing voice which is rather more akin to his natural speaking voice is David Bowie. He's the guy that sounds kind of more like himself, and I think that's just so much more attractive than when I heard Mick Jagger on the radio this morning. I haven't listened to the Rolling Stones for a while, and my jaw was this, what is this man singing? What is this silly voice about? It just seems to me so patently ridiculous. I mean, I can understand why people get hooked on it early on. Sure. It's the fantasy of wanting to sound like these things and these heroes that you have when you're growing up. But you would have thought after a year or two you would want to develop your own thing and sound like you without faking the ridiculous accent that seems so silly.
We're doing a thing besides a piece on prog rock. That label was attached to you guys.
No, it's not. No, people have attached it, but it is like a very badly attached luggage label on a piece of really crappy luggage going on some package tour to the south of Spain. It's going to fall off before you get to where you're going, and it fell off me back around 1973. Mm-hmm. That particular luggage label disappeared from my life. So, prog rock is to me just it's a little bit of a bit of musical fun, a little bit of musical bombast, more appropriately attached to the folks who did it pretty well, like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But the era of prog rock and Jethro Tull's sort of connection with it were two albums that were sort of, particularly with Thick as a Brick, were a spoof or a send-up. It was Spinal Tap does prog rock. It was supposed to be a joke, supposed to be fun, kind of a bit of a satire on the concept album genre. But in making a joke of it, it somehow, in some people's eyes and ears, it became Jethro Tull's prog rock moment. And it's sort of okay, but prog rock is alive and curiously still quite ill today in the hands of a lot of young, particularly European acts who go out and about struggling to make a living doing prog rock and sounding like early Genesis or a favourite of prog rock bands, and Yes to perhaps a lesser extent. So there's plenty of prog rock bands out there just doing the same old noodling stuff, which is, if you want to listen to prog rock, listen to Yes. At least they do it well, and they still do it, and it's them, it's those guys, So if you're going to listen to that stuff, get the real thing. But I don't find it very easy to listen to the endless noodling that comes from would-be prog rockers aged, 22 and sort of living in some weird kind of time warp thing, and wanting to have their album covers done by Roger Dean if they ever do get to make an album.
you're here celebrating Aqualung, obviously. How proud are you of that work? Is that your proudest achievement? Are there certain albums that you hold as your greatest achievements? You look at your career that way? Or?
Not really. It doesn't. It's not album by album. It's more song by song. I have songs that are my favourites, but then, you know, they could be my favourite for 6 months, and then I change my mind and kind of go off them a bit and switch to something else that becomes my favourite song or sets of songs for a while. But I'm a song by song person rather than an album by album in terms of my own, you know, ideas about what's good, bad, and acceptable. You know, amongst the things that I've done. But no,
one song you'll always play live and you'll never tire of.
Well, there are probably a couple of songs from the Aqualung album. Yeah, Aqualung is a good album for me personally because it marked a point where I think Jethro Tull sort of separated out a little bit from the riffmeisters of the era, you know, the Deep Purples and the Black Sabbaths and those sort of folks. Because suddenly there were, you know, kind of acoustic guitars and a lot of arrangements which were a bit more organic, and many of the recordings that were done on the Aqualung album, which had quite a few acoustic pieces on, were just done by me in the studio when the other guys were late for work or something. I would just sit there and say, oh, I've got this song here, let's bang this down. And then they would show up and maybe add a little bit of something to it, or a string quartet would, you know, come and play something or whatever it might be. And that was kind of good. It marked a point where I stepped not outside of rock music, but just alongside rock music. So it seemed to me perfectly plausible to make a record where the dynamic range from big kind of riffy things, you know, big motifs, you know, ba 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 ba, you know, could live happily alongside some strumming acoustic guitar or or a weepy violin or whatever. So I think in that sense, it's an album that demonstrates maybe not for rock music as a whole, but for me, a bit of a maturity in the approach to being a sort of rock band that could also do this other stuff, which was a little bit more sensitive and varied, and had this bigger dynamic range, which to me is important. I like I like a little bit of loud music, but not too much of it, and I like acoustic music, but not all the time. Sometimes it's nice to go bang, make a big noise, and sometimes it's nice just to be whisper quiet. And the one thing I would say to all musicians contemplating a serious musical career or even playing for fun is just remember what Eric Clapton knows and a few other notable contemporary musicians know. It's the spaces between the notes that are as important as the notes themselves. It's the gaps between that give the notes context. And if you can't see fresh air between the notes of a guitar solo, then you're missing, I think, a big ingredient of what music is about. It is about space, texture, and that sense that music is transparent. But when it becomes or keyboard, that's just diarrhea. I mean, that is musical dysentery. I know, I've done some of it, and I deeply regret it. I must go. I've got to go back to get ready because we have a show.
Of course.
Thanks.
No, yeah, thank you.
No. Okay, good. Now I'm going to whip this off if I may, because I'm kind of late for work. Here we go.